And I worked for 5 years in Silicon Valley in a company that was working on personal genetics. So you're right, there's two components to your glucose levels. There's like your baseline, which is basically your fasting glucose and where your glucose naturally sits. And then you have these spikes that happen after every meal.
Jesse, hi, good morning.
Hola.
We're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Kendra.
Actually, I jumped into your account and your work, maybe starting this like January or something. And it was funny because I went to send you a message like saying, "Hey, I like your work." I saw that you texted me before. Like,
Yeah, like years ago.
no, no, how is this? It's amazing. Jesse, cuéntanos por favor sobre cuál ha sido tu camino de estudio. ¿Tú a qué te dedicas? ¿En qué trabajas? Vi que estudiaste bioquímica.
So I'm a trained mathematician and biochemist, and I worked for 5 years in Silicon Valley in a company that was working on personal genetics. And about 3 years ago, I quit that to dedicate myself full time to communicating the latest science about blood sugar, why it affects us, why it's important, and how you can heal based on information that is in the science. So now I'm a full-time glucose goddess. That's my job.
Y lo has hecho muy bien. Realmente
Gracias.
eres la diosa en la glucosa. Qué trabajo tan maravilloso. ¿Cómo pasaste del interés por las matemáticas a la bioquímica? Porque a mí me pasó lo mismo. Yo pasé de la cirugía y después di la vuelta por medicina funcional y después dije, yo necesito estudiar bioquímica y estudié bioquímica. ¿Cómo llegaste a la bioquímica?
So in my last year of studying mathematics, I actually had an accident. I broke my back. And I started suffering a lot physically and mentally. And I realized, Carlos, that the most important thing in life is our health. And I needed to figure out how to heal myself. And so that's why I then went to study biochemistry in grad school, really out of a personal necessity to feel better because I felt completely broken on the inside.
Yeah. La bioquímica realmente es fascinante y resuelve demasiadas cosas, ¿sí? Independientemente por donde en la situación en la que te pongas, resuelve demasiadas cosas. Para mí, en mi práctica clínica, ha sido muy valioso. Ha sido muy valioso. Jesse, ¿cómo llegaste a tener el interés por estudiar la glucosa?
So after studying biochemistry, I was still searching for answers. I was still hungry to understand how my body worked. And so first I went into genetics because back then we thought that, DNA was everything. It was going to help us understand our bodies and everything was programmed in your DNA.
Yeah,
But then after a few, huh?
the genetic determinism.
Exactly. And after a few years there, I discovered that's not the case. And your DNA doesn't tell you what you need to do to wake up in the morning feeling good. And by complete hazard, by complete randomness, we were able, inside of the company I was working in, to test a glucose monitor because, it was Silicon Valley. And so people are always testing new devices. And so I had the opportunity to put on a glucose monitor for the first time.
Now, for your health today, we should find out what Trudy's doing down there, don't you think, Dr. Bruce? But Bruce is here to talk about your smartphone and how it can also be a life-saving health device.
Well, Colleen, she looks very healthy. I hope I'm that healthy at 106. Now, diabetics have to check their blood sugar many times a day to make sure it doesn't get dangerous. But this task is being made easier and mobile thanks to this smartphone technology.
And it completely changed everything for me in a few ways. First, I felt like I could finally understand what was happening underneath my skin. I finally had a way to communicate with my biology. I could see on my iPhone screen what happened after I ate, after I exercised, if I was tired, if I was not tired, if I was stressed. I felt like I finally had a dialogue with my biology. And second, I realized that glucose spikes, so very rapid increases in blood sugar concentration, were one of the triggers for my mental health problems. And that was groundbreaking because for a decade I was suffering and I didn't even know why these mental health problems were coming on. I had no clue. So I became very fascinated in the topic and I discovered a few things. I discovered that one, I was not alone. About 90% of the population has glucose spikes every day without knowing it. And depending on, your background, you might feel them in very different ways. You might feel cravings, tiredness, you might have fertility issues, acne. Anyway, for me, it was mental health, but glucose spikes affect every single one of us. And then I discovered that from the scientific studies, there were very easy things you could do that allowed you to avoid the spikes, feel better without doing a very strict diet or anything. And so this information, changed my life and people wanted me to share it. So I started sharing it with my friends, my family, then online. And now it's what I do because everybody needs to know.
You started testing on yourself. You started testing on yourself. You started looking at I think maybe you started looking at articles that maybe showed you some answers and then testing on yourself and seeing what happened.
Exactly. In a way, the self-testing allowed me to sort of illustrate what I was finding in the scientific papers. So for example, I would find a paper that said that if you eat your food in the right order, you reduce the glucose spike of the meal. And so what I did is with my own device, I would test that and do one meal in the right order, one meal in the wrong order, and show the difference in spike. And then use that to share with my family, my friends, to illustrate the science, to make it tangible, to make it accessible, to make it exciting. I was really just trying to communicate and make the science cool and helpful.
Yeah. And it's funny again because when I found your work, like years before, I was sharing with people, drink some apple cider vinegar before your meals and try to take a walk or jump or jog or do whatever, do squats after you eat because it's gonna consume some of the glucose that it's available and the spike is gonna come down. But actually I saw a couple studies that you share and that you follow about the order, and we're gonna talk about it. But I really never paid attention to it until I was already using the monitor and I said like, let's take a look. And it was amazing.
That's amazing.
And I started laughing. And it was funny actually because I could see that foods that I thought that were like, okay, they give me like a huge spike. Jesse, you tested on yourself, and you said that you started sharing with friends. How many people did you have the chance to observe during the time with the monitors that you actually have good
data on
information?
Like how many people were wearing glucose monitors and I could see their curves as well, you mean? And my friends and family? Maybe 20, 30, I would say. But again, sorry?
For how much time?
Not very long. They would wear them for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, but I was not using their data to draw any conclusions. I'm just using the studies and then illustrating them with individuals' glucose data. But I haven't drawn any conclusions apart from the fact that glucose spikes were triggering my mental health problems. I haven't drawn any conclusions from my individual data. I really just use it as a way to communicate and explain the science that exists.
Okay. Because I think that it's very interesting, and it's something that we really need. Because we only think that glucose monitors or making a continuous glucose monitoring, it's something for diabetics, and that's it. And we forget two things. One, 7 out of 10 diabetics are not diagnosed.
Wow.
And two, 80% of the population in the US, the 66% of the population in the world have metabolic problems.
Yeah.
Metabolic problems come from insulin spikes, obviously from glucose spikes and fructose spikes. But 80% in the US, 66% out of the US. So if we make if we try to monitor people out from the diabetics, I know that we are going to find very, very useful information. And I think that this is something.
And even beyond that, even if you look at people who are metabolically completely healthy, they can still have spikes into the diabetic range after foods like breakfast cereal. And that was a study out of Stanford that showed that. So from what I've seen and from what the studies suggest, honestly, virtually everybody experiences glucose spikes, whether they're currently metabolically healthy, whether they're on the path towards metabolic dysfunction, whether they have type 2 diabetes. Like, this concerns everyone. And now we know that glucose spikes, they lead to things as simple as cravings and being more hungry before your next meal. Like, these are things that most of us experience every single day. I believe everyone benefits from, using the advice that I shared to flatten their glucose curves. Like, everybody feels better. It's a foundation of how to be healthy these days. We really have to know this information.
Yeah. It's something that I learned from following you, because I never saw that before. Is the fact that we always think that we need to have like a range of glucose, and if you're in between 70 and 90 in a fasting glucose, then you're okay. And you point out that it's not all about the range, but you can have your own range. Like, my baseline could be 95, and if I'm always in 95, then that's my range. Of course, my range it's not going to be 126. But I mean, under 95 and between, I need to look and see what's my baseline. Yours could be 72, and that's yours.
Yeah.
And that after eating, what we need to see is that we don't raise, or we don't have a spike that it's higher than 30. Would you tell us something more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. There's two components to your glucose levels. There's like your baseline, which is basically your fasting glucose and where your glucose naturally sits. And then you have these spikes that happen after every meal. And the spikes are actually what is more damaging to your body, especially what's more damaging to your cells. From the research studies, we know that, for example, if you have a baseline that's lower, but you're spiking a lot all the time, that's actually worse for your body than having a higher baseline but being more steady. So it's the variability that we want to avoid. And so these spikes, what we call them, the definition is still, a little bit debated, because really a bigger spike is always worse than a smaller spike. But there's a cutoff that is accepted by people in the community that is 30 milligrams per deciliter. And the objective should be, after a meal, to not spike by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter. However, I would say any reduction in your spike is going to be helpful to your body. So if you're somebody who usually has massive, massive spikes, maybe 50, 100 milligrams, if you're able to bring that down to, let's say, 75, or a spike of 75, that's already a win. It's on a spectrum. It's about figuring out where you are and then trying to do a little bit better. And that's going to bring you a lot of health benefits.
I think that glucose monitors I've been using them for like 3 or 4 months maybe.
Nonstop.
Yeah, nonstop. For me, it's been super useful. Again, because as you say, when I learn about myself, when I see the data, when I cross the data with my own practice, I can validate. It's not something I believe. It's not something I'm just gonna criticize or validate without using it. No. I've validated on myself. Now I can teach you, or not you. I mean, teach someone like you. You know, I've been learning this. Do you think that I think it would be amazing, because you say on the book that the monitors only check glucose, but it would be very interesting for a monitor to check on glucose, on fructose, and it would be amazing to check on insulin.
Absolutely. Yeah, insulin is really where we want to go. That's the reason we want to go towards insulin is because your insulin levels are a much better determinant of your metabolic health than your glucose levels. You can have normal glucose levels, but really high insulin levels, and that would point to the fact that you're on the way towards metabolic dysfunction. So ideally, we would have insulin monitors. Unfortunately, that's really difficult to do. So we can use glucose monitors to try to approximate what's happening in an insulin world. And I think that, if you have information like the one you're sharing with your patients and like the ones that's in my content, as somebody wearing a glucose monitor for the first time, you can sort of understand the big principles and they can guide you towards making sense of your glucose data. But it's definitely something that's very new. And I think it's definitely helpful if you have access to one and you can understand it with context. But for me, at the beginning, for example, I was really confused about the data. Before I learned all the scientific studies and, did a lot of research, it can be quite difficult to understand what's happening. What's that spike? What's that drop? What does it mean? It's a whole new field and we have a lot of education to do.
Jesse, you were pointing that the spike shouldn't be higher than 30, but that's on the quantity. How about over time? Over time, what's the ideal range for a spike to rise?
Like how long?
I think it could be as detrimental if you make a spike of 60 or a spike for 3 or 4 hours.
Ideally, you want to come back down within 2 hours. Okay. And if your spike stays up, it can be due to multiple things. It can be because there was a lot of fat in the meal. And so the fat is sort of delaying the influx of glucose into the blood. It can also be because there's a dysfunction. You have insulin resistance, or there's something going on in your body that it's not able to bring glucose back down. In terms of is it better to have a 30 spike that comes down in 4 hours or 20 spike in 6 hours? That's really hard to say. We don't really know. And I wouldn't be able to answer it. We just know that the higher variability, the worse. And you should be able to bring your glucose down to baseline within 2 hours without crashing below baseline and going back up, because that's reactive hypoglycemia. And that really, that encourages cravings and hunger. So you want something that spikes, that comes back down, that spikes, that comes back down. Then it's, that's the best scenario.
Let's talk about the crash. It's funny because I've seen it on myself. And I'm going to tell you what made me crash worse.
Tell me.
It was plantain when it's sweet. After it kind of gets before it raws, it comes sweet. I had lunch in the right order. That we're going to talk in a minute. In the right order, and I ate a ton of veggies, a ton, always. And at the end, I ate some plantain as a puree. It was a plantain puree, and I ate it, and I had a rise to 160. I was like, "What's this? This is amazing,
crazy."
My baseline.
And if you had not had the vegetables, it would have been even worse.
Yeah. And then I had a crash. Nothing happened. I had no headaches or anxiety or nothing.
Yeah.
But I saw the crash. How many units under the baseline do you consider it a crash? because you can always have like a slight hypoglycemia. It's my understanding it was that if it doesn't come down under 15 units under baseline or under fasting glucose, that's considered a crash. But what do you understand like a crash?
That's a good question. I haven't actually figured out like a specific cutoff, and I don't think the literature has figured out a specific cutoff. We just know, for example, there's this cool paper that just came out from King's College in London. We just know that the bigger it's called a dip essentially. The bigger the dip below baseline, the more acute the symptoms are going to be. So ideally, you don't want to dip below baseline at all. Like that would be ideal. And of course, a -5 dip is going to lead to fewer symptoms than a -50 dip. But then it's all kind of on a spectrum. And, on the topic of making these very strict cutoffs, for example, the spike. So the cutoff is 30. But I'm not saying that if it's 29, it's fine. And if it's 31, all of a sudden it's really bad. It's like, it's a gradient. It's like, it's always better to be flatter. But biology is not, your body is not like, oh, it's under 30, everything's fine. And then, oh, it's 31, bad stuff happens. Yeah. It all happens on this gradient. Yeah. I know you know that, but I think it's important to mention it because these numbers we use as a way to guide us. But we should think more about how we're improving the spike, how we're reducing the dip, than being really focused on the exact number. The objective is just to give people tools to so that they're steadier, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. It happens to me all the time. People come super anxious to my office, like, my total cholesterol is 203. And I'm like, yeah. And it says here 200. And I'm like, yeah. So what? Let's look at the rest of the things. Let's look at your HDL, your insulin, your ferritin, your triglycerides. Everything is fine. Come on. Yeah, don't worry. No. The other guy said that I need to start in statins. Well, I don't agree. Because all the rest of your ApoB, everything is fine. Don't worry. I mean, we're like so narrow sometimes on the way that we think on science, and we think.
But it can be scary, and I think that's one of the reasons that glucose monitors, they still have a long way to go, because right now, just giving the raw data to somebody who doesn't know what it means can be really stressful. You can think, oh my God, it's 101 when I wake up, and just obsess over the small numbers, and it can create anxiety. When really it's about the big picture and zooming out, being like, look at the curve of your day. Can tomorrow you make it a bit steadier? That's really what we're trying to teach to people. But yeah, we tend to be obsessed with the numbers. Absolutely.
Yeah, people want to be measuring everything. It's like
people want a yes to no answer. They want to know like good or bad.
Yeah. And people sometimes they get obsessed with being perfect.
Yeah.
And being perfect is always, it's impossible.
Absolutely.
And there is a saying that we use here that says that perfect is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And it's something that we see all the time.